Yeah, well, good morning. We are in Taksim Square in Istanbul. This would normally be one of the busiest spots in this city. It's a little bit quieter this morning. I think a bit of a slow start, and you can forgive the Turks. I think most of them were up all night watching this election. It was a very, very close one, according to the polls, but also what we saw. Effectively, what we know is that President Erdogan had a pretty significant lead at the beginning of the night, but then as those bigger cities started to come in, Istanbul, Ankara, Antalya, his vote share really started to fall until that moment just after midnight when he dropped below that crucial 50% mark. Now, he is still about 2.5 million votes ahead of his opponent, 74-year-old Kemal Kilicdaroglu. However, the fact that he's under that 50% means we are probably looking at a runoff here. There is not many votes left to count, and if he wants to try and get back over 50%, the arithmetic is just not looking good. It means we will have 2 more weeks, I suspect, of a very combative, highly emotionally charged campaign between these two sides in what is a very pivotal moment for this country.
Talk to us a little bit more about, some of the reactions going into this. And I mean, obviously, this is a very big moment for Turkey, and we sort of emphasise that in our news. The West not necessarily liking this, Russia, because of course Erdogan's relationship with Putin is that one of a good one. But I mean, just kind of, what hinges on the winning of this election?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, when you speak to foreign policy analysts here, in fact, I spoke to one earlier this week, or last week now, sorry, we've had a long night, and they say, look, Turkey effectively has been a middleman a lot in this conflict in Ukraine, and that's a role that President Erdogan actually cherishes in some ways. He has supplied weapons to Ukraine, but he's also continued to negotiate with President Putin over things like the Ukrainian grain deal, which has seen about 30 million tonnes of grain come out from the Black Sea and off to places like Eastern Africa. Obviously, the West has been watching this race very closely because they know that Erdogan is, a leader of a NATO country. Turkey is a NATO member, but he does still talk to Russia, for example, whereas Kilicdaroglu has promised a more pro-European approach if he is to win, a more pro-NATO approach. He said he won't undo entirely the relationship with Russia, but he certainly indicated he would be closer to the West, and I think that is why many eyes across Europe and the United States were watching this race, because effectively Turkey has really grown to be a pretty dominant player in this part of the world, both in Europe but also in the Middle East. So what happens here really does have a ripple-on effect across this region.
So just to wrap it up for us very quickly, obviously the winner needs to get over 50%, and we saw Erdogan dropping below. He's sitting at about, well, I mean, you please correct me, obviously you've got the latest figures, 49.3%, and the opposition coalition, 35, are much lower than that. So does this mean that the runoff will happen, and that runoff is at the end of this month?
Yeah, extremely likely that it will happen, unless there's some big shock surprise this morning. The opposition is still behind, and we have to be clear about that. They're about 2.5 million votes behind. So going into a runoff, you would certainly prefer to be in Erdogan's camp. They are ahead of that runoff, but they are still below the 50%. So it will be in exactly 2 weeks' time on May the 28th for that second round vote. A huge moment for Erdogan. He's never had to go to a second round. He's always won in the first round. So in many ways, his campaign is already quite unprecedented. The result, as I say, will be watched not just by millions of Turks here, but many across the entire region.